Coalition for Community Living. Today we're going to be joined by Milan Sverepa from Inclusion Europe, and Milan's going to be sharing some thoughts and experiences of taking forward deinstitutionalisation and promoting independent living for all from his work with Inclusion Europe and prior to that. We'll be recording this interview and sharing the YouTube through the European Network for Independent Living's YouTube channel next week, and we hope that you have a chance to watch, listen, and then share your thoughts as we go forward. Welcome along, Milan. Over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for having me. As you said, I'm director of Inclusion Europe. I'm also one of the co-chairs of the European Expert Group on transition from institutional care to community-based care. And before I became director of Inclusion Europe, I worked on deinstitutionalization in Czechia, Serbia, Moldova, and we met recently in Romania at a seminar organized by the European Commission to talk about deinstitutionalization, and that led to us having this conversation. I think the seminar here was sort of also, I would say, maybe giving the framework to what I would like to say. Before we get to that, of course, I would like to introduce Inclusion Europe. Inclusion Europe is an organization representing people with intellectual disabilities and their families. We have members in 39 European countries, and deinstitutionalization is one of the key topics that we work on, that we focus on, both directly as Inclusion Europe and with many of our members in different countries. What I would like to talk about, and if you can get to the next slides, next one, please. Yes. What I would like to talk about is basically to kind of draw the attention back to action, I would say. And I think that was motivated a lot by the experiences that I sometimes have at various conversations, not just at seminars or conferences, but overall when participating in different contexts on the institutionalization. I think that sometimes, I would say, there's a tendency to overcook it, to make it terribly wordy and complicated and complex, and that might be discouraging people from actually taking action and helping people to leave institutions and live independently and become included in society. So this is what I would like to talk about a little bit. If you can move to the next slide. My first thing I would like to contribute to this conversation is it's not a rocket science. It's obviously difficult in certain aspects, as is any number of human activity. It is obviously also complicated in the sense that it deals with people and influences people directly as impact on their lives. So we must, of course, proceed with caution, but it is not a rocket science. It is still a process that's being done in many countries. It is still a process that is being done in different countries right now at this moment, in different contexts and different scales. And it's still a process that is perfectly manageable, and we should treat it as such. Sometimes I have the impression that with how deinstitutionalization is being presented and being talked about, we overcomplicate things. Sometimes there's the tendency to describe it in its complexity, if the utmost of the complexity, and that, in my view, makes it very difficult for people who are supposed to be doing the institutionalization in reality to be doing that. Because if we go into saying things like it is a complex process and it is difficult and it contains this and it contains that, and you have to think also about this aspect and this element, the message we are giving to people is basically it's very difficult. It's very hard to do. And that is, I think, something that we should think of more and proceed with caution about. To be more specific and use an example, for example, the seminar that we both attended was, I think, a good illustration of that, unfortunately. Because I would say that in the first half, there was kind of an interesting conversation about how the institutionalization in Romania is progressing, the things that they have achieved, especially in regards to children's institution, closing institution for more than 170,000 children. They've done it obviously in very complicated context. And that was an interesting conversation, taking into account the local questions and the local context. And after, in the second half, we suddenly started to have a conversation about, oh, should we be doing this? And should we be doing this? And what should be, I know, people with disabilities doing and ministries doing? And the whole conversation became very abstract, very unspecific, and very complex. And I think that the message ultimately becomes unclear and very difficult for people to handle. And so that for me is one of the aspects I would like to, I wanted to talk about, that we should be trying to simplify things and to find a way of talking about deinstitutionalization in a way that encourages people to actually do it. And one of those aspects would be to kind of try to make it less complex and sound it less complex than we usually do. Another aspect of reflecting on the experience, I believe that for people listening to this and working with VNIL and similar organizations, this is not necessarily something terribly new, but I think can also help in kind of making less complex the conversations. It's focus on building relationships and not building houses. And that's something that we should be encouraging everyone, from the funding authorities to service providers to whoever else is taking the decisions. I think that too much of the conversation around the institutionalization is actually about houses, about the shape of services, about the size of buildings, and that's not, and it should be instead more focused on how do we help people leaving institutions in establishing good and healthy relationship with people. That's the skills that they have. They didn't have the opportunities to learn and to build during their life in institutions. The lack of the social relationships is going to be one of the things that is quite likely to influence the people's ability to function in the new surroundings. When you, for example, look at the examples of self-advocates involved at Inclusion Europe, this is often the topic that they talk about. It's not about do we live in this sort of house or that sort of house. It's about, do we have the right relations? Do we have the right support? In the words of Elizabeta Moldovan from Romania, she said at one of our recent conversations, like, I didn't trust anyone, and it took me 8 years to start trusting anyone. And if I didn't have people around me who gave me the opportunity and had the patience for me to do this, to overcome this, I would be likely back in an institution now. So this is an aspect that we should be talking more about. How do we support people to build relationships, not build houses? And last element I wanted to highlight during this opening segment was drawing attention to the people who are very often left behind in many of the deinstitutionalization efforts. And by that I mean people who have complex support needs, or for example, children with disabilities. Also, very often what we see in reality that these are people who are left in the institutions, who are left behind there with all sorts of reasonings from the relevant authorities. And then when we talk about this, the question often comes is, so how should it be done differently? And what I would offer to that is how it should be done differently is that the whole deinstitutionalization process should start with the people that are considered to be less likely to succeed in community, or to be who are considered by some to have less ability to live independently, or whatever the reasoning is. Because if the solutions are built for them and work for them, they will work for everyone. If the solutions and the services and the system is able to support people who have complex support needs, it will be able to support those who have less complex support needs. If the alternative to family-based care, for example, or whatever else the children's services work for children with disabilities, they are more likely to work for any other children. So that's my last message at this opening sequence. We should be starting the processes with focus on those who are usually considered to be less likely to succeed in the community and are very often left behind. So that was my opening offering to this conversation. And it's not a rocket science, and such we should focus on actual actions and how to encourage people who are supposed to be doing the institutionalization by describing it in offering it in a simple, less complex way, and then focusing on building relationships instead of houses, and starting with those who might have more complex support needs. So, Nick, as I said, this was my opening for this conversation, and I hope that fulfilled your expectations in a way, and we can get on with if there are any more questions that you think might be interesting.
I think the bit about the rocket science was part of the first thing that I was going to ask you about, and maybe you could draw on some of your experience of working in the Czech Republic as well. About we both experienced when we were in Bucharest in Romania how overwhelming people can find thinking about the whole thing, and how big it is, and how that leads to discussions and plans getting lost, and really people feeling not able to do anything. But thinking about your experiences, what one or two things that can help when in that kind of situation, what would you be thinking might help people when they're getting lost?
I think it might be very very useful to kind of distinguish between the different levels of responsibilities and roles people have in the process. What I see often is that all the different levels, from service providers to, I don't know, regional or national authorities up to the European level, are sometimes mixed up and discussed all at the same times, which makes it very complex and overwhelming. I actually, if it is sort of sliced down to the individual responsibilities and roles of people in their respective positions, then it becomes much more easier to process and to actually action on those things. It is the same as in when you apply that process in an institution. Director has a different role in the process compared to someone who is providing direct support to users of the service. So again, it might be a complex process overall, but different people have different responsibilities and different roles. And I think one of the key things that to make it simple, make it more manageable and actionable people, is to distinguish between these roles and just talk to them specifically about what their role and what their responsibility is and what is expected from them specifically in their line of job they are doing.
Yeah, I think one of the things I think we when we were keep going back to Bucharest, but it was a really I met some really good people, and a couple of the people there shared stories of actually their experiences now they'd moved out of institutions, and both are leading their own kind of self-advocacy groups, and it leads into the other part of, I think, experience shows that it's always good to talk about success as well. And I'm wondering what sort of glimpses of really good work or success for people with intellectual disabilities you've encountered. If there's one example or a couple of examples that shine out to you, that kind of tells people it does work and it is worth the hard work.
Well, I think that's also another key element of making the process more likely to succeed, is to highlight the positive experiences and encouraging people that we expect to do the actual work, let's to put it this way, by saying first it is possible to do, and second to appreciate what they've done. You've already mentioned the example that comes directly to my mind. That's our colleagues from Romania, both Elisabeta Moldovan from Cevadespus and also from Pentru Voi, who were both present in the seminar. If you would skip a slide or two, I think I have a slide with Elisabeta right here. I've already talked about her and the point about building relationships. What is also, I think, important we can take from her experience growing up in institutions and now being very active both at national and European level in fighting institutions is the desire to overcome the experiences. As you can see here, is co-written a book about her life. She's sharing her story in a very attractive way and making sure that people can relate to the situation in institutions and understand why it needs to change. And that is one of the successful examples. Now she is involved in Romania in a project that basically is about securing rented living arrangements for people living in institutions. So they have set up a new service. They rent flats and they will rent them out to people living in institutions. Another good examples could be from the other countries that are using EU funds to close down institutions and to build alternative living arrangements and then set up new services. I've recently noticed that the European Commission, for example, has highlighted on its website a service provider from the north of Czech Republic, which does exactly this. They have a supported living program, they have supported employment program, they are taking people out of institutions and providing them with living arrangements in normal flats and normal houses and supporting them in the transition and then letting them go, so to speak, into a normal jobs and an open market. So we could and there are many more examples all over Europe. What is, of course, challenging is to turn these practices and example into more systemic change, so they become the norm instead of the exception.
Yeah. And what role do you feel like the European Commission or pan-European organisations can have in that? Standing back from thinking about the local, the kind of across Europe, what are the key things that the big actors could be doing, maybe differently to what they're doing now, or how can they take this forward?
Well, I think there are three key elements. First, obviously, is money. So a lot of the positive developments around the institutionalization right now are funded and are actually happening thanks to EU structural funds. Directly connected to that is that the European Union is in certain respects much more likely to apply CRPD rights and the deinstitutionalisation principles in its thinking and its funding than the states would necessarily be on their own. So there is also the pressure from, let's say, the European level to national level that these things need to happen and these things need to change. I think these are the two obvious ones. The one I would like to talk about most is the third element, and that's the exchange of knowledge, of know-how, of experiences, and it's the benefit of being able to work across different countries, so that via European Union networks or networks such as Inclusion Europe or the EEG or whatever else, there is the possibility to share the experiences, to share what works in a certain context, what doesn't, to exchange the knowledge and expertise. And unfortunately, deinstitutionalization is a pan-European problem because it affects institutions are basically in all EU countries, or at least most of them. But it also means that this can be shared, the challenge can be shared, and we can find common solutions, and we don't have to spend time inventing the wheel in every single country.
Yeah. Cool. And as one final thing is, and it's always really good to end with kind of a story. Maybe you've shared some stories about Elisabetta and some of the other people you've met. So maybe this is a bit repetitive, but it's just wondering whether there's a story that you would leave people with as a kind of provoking thought that we can do this, a story about success.
Well, if you can go one slide back. Yes, thank you. Basically, ever since I came to Inclusion Europe, whenever we have the conversation, then the opportunity about the institutionalization, I for one reason or another, think of Senada Hall Church. And I think back about the many conversations I used to have with people in different institutions, or people working at ministries, or people working for organizations who are actually taking quite a lot of money to provide advice and expertise to those doing the institutionalization. And we all often had the conversation like, oh, this person, it's not good for them, and this person wouldn't succeed, and and this is too complicated. Senada grew up in an institution. She spent most of her life in an institution, and Senada is now one of the leading activists in Croatia on disability issues. She's a vice president of Inclusion Europe. She's chair of the European Platform of Self-Advocates. She travels around Europe talking about disability issues and deinstitutionalizations. She also travels around Europe doing all sorts of sports and I don't know what. And I always think back on these conversations and the people who say, oh, this is not possible and this person is not capable of something, that person is not capable of something, and we have to keep them in an institution or in some sort of service. I think, look here, it's nobody, I think, at the time would think that all this is possible, but it is. But we also, to go to what she, the quote here on the slide is that all of this, I was describing her being a vice president of an European network and then going to all sorts of sports events across Europe and then having an independent and in many respects successful life is a very fragile arrangement for her. And she's constantly aware of that and afraid that she might have to return to an institution because that's one of the most challenging aspects of all this, I think, is to make sure that the services that actually support independent living are reliable and are providing security to people, and that applies also to those who currently do not live in institutions but live in the fear that they might one day end up there because there would be lack of services. So with slightly of the fragility of the services, but with the very uplifting story, I think, in this context, and about breaking the expectation or exceeding the expectations that many people often have about people with intellectual disabilities and what is possible for them, and yeah, so that's Senada's contribution to it, in my words at least.
Thank you. It's really useful, Milan, to have your thoughts. I'm wondering if I'm going to skip a couple of slides, and if you just wanted to take this as a chance to mention this event that Inclusion Europe are leading on in June.
Yes, thank you. European Action in Vilnius in first week of June. European Action is a conference that we organize every year. And this year it will be about independent living and inclusion in community. It is directly reflecting on the progress that Lithuania achieved in especially services for children, and building on experiences of Lithuania and of other countries, and how we can build on that and exceed it to services for adults. Let's say we'll have people from all over Europe going from Spain to Kazakhstan, so way beyond the European Union. And I would invite anybody who is interested in learning more about what's going on in supported decision making and inclusion in community and deinstitutionalization to go to the website europeanaction.org and check out the program and register and come to Vilnius. And if you would go one slide back, I would also like to talk briefly about the report we did recently as Inclusion Europe. which is very much connected to our conversation here. It's a report about violence against women with intellectual disabilities in institutions. What I would especially highlight here is the way it was conducted and the way how it illustrated it is possible to address this issue. It's possible to engage in a conversation about violence and experience of violence, because we often hear that it is very difficult and it is sometimes possible to talk about this with people with intellectual disabilities. So I think having a look at this report might be a good inspiration to see that it is actually possible to do it. And it also goes to illustrate the importance of providing support to people who lived in institutions once they left it, and taking into account the experiences and how the traumas of living in institutions and the experiences of the abuse and violence may influence their functioning in the community, and taking that into an account to make sure that the transition is successful for them.
Yeah, thank you. As people will see, there's a reminder here to vote in the elections on the 23rd to the 26th of May. And there's information here about getting in touch, Twitter links, Facebook pages, and Milan's email. These will all be shared when we send out the recording of the interview in the next week or so. So thank you very much, Milan. It's been really good speaking with you today. And I think time to go.
Well, thank you for having me. I hope it's going to be useful for the listeners and viewers. And yeah, let's continue the conversation, but mostly do less words, do more works.
Brilliant. Thank you.